Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Bible study, stepping into what's next, biblical lessons for in between times. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the class will look like, kind of an overview of what these sessions will be. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what prompted this whole Bible study in the first place. So, basically, as I've talked to many of y'all and other folks in our congregation, as I've kind of looked around at the world and looked at our church, what's clear is that so many of us are in transition in one way or another. And one way to describe what that is with a word that is liminality. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that word means in just a minute. But that's kind of really the basis for this whole study, this whole Bible study, is looking at moments in the Bible in which people find themselves in these in-between times, these liminal spaces, if you will. So today we're going to talk about Adam and Eve and the moments after they were exiled from the garden. We're going to talk about a few other stories from the Hebrew scriptures, maybe Noah, Aaron and the golden calf, and we're going to talk about some New Testament stories as well. Examples of when the disciples or Jesus or other figures in the New Testament found themselves in these liminal spaces, in these in-between times. So, what is a liminal space? What does that even mean? I'm going to share my screen and talk to you a little bit about that. So, can y'all see this? Y'all
Yes.
see a picture of a door?
Yes.
Okay. So, the word liminal comes from the Latin word for threshold. And so, if you look at this little diagram of a door, you've got the jamb, you've got the stop, you've got the panels, all that good stuff. And then down here at the bottom is the threshold. And so the threshold is the marker, a physical marker between one space and another.
Mm.
And over the history of humans, people have had all kinds of cultural rituals and practices and traditions and superstitions about the threshold. So, for example, in some cultures, it's considered bad luck to shake hands across a threshold. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the tradition of when two folks get married, the groom carries the bride over the threshold. Or to update that for the 21st century, one of the married partners carries the other married partner across the threshold. And that's considered good luck. It's a way of marking that we are moving into this next space, this next reality together. What
Mm.
happens though when you get to a point in your life where you're kind of stuck at the threshold? Or maybe not stuck, but you're at the threshold, not quite out of the former space and not quite into the new space. That's what we're going to be talking about. And that's what I mean when I use this word liminal space. Here are a few folks' attempts to describe what liminal space feels like or looks like. This is from Kirsten Franklin, who is a New York-based mindset expert and transformation coach, because that's a thing. Liminal space is where one thing ends and another is about to begin, but you are not quite there yet. You are in the space between. Liminal space is also a really big concept in Jungian psychology. And so here's Dr. Teresa Dito Bustillo from the Carl Jung Center Circle. Here's what she has to say. Carl Jung used the word liminality to describe that time in the process of individuation where a person becomes themselves, an individual, a fully actualized individual, where you know you cannot go back to who you were, but don't know yet what you are becoming. Then finally, Susan Beaumont, in a really great book that's sort of the inspiration for this whole series, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, she writes, this disorientation carries with it a sense of anguish and existential fear. Being in these liminal spaces involves facing into a void. It involves the collapse of order and status as we come to understand it. As dangerous as a liminal state may feel, though, it is also alluring. The suddenly malleable situation invites originality, generativity, and creativity. If you'll think about these definitions and explanations for what liminal space is, can you think of examples, times in life in general, maybe times in your own life in which you've been in a liminal space?
Well, Tony, I want to address something else. Those first two examples, for certain, somewhat the third, reminds me of a person dying and how they're in, this world transitioning into the next. They're not quite in one or the other. They keep coming in and out until the transition is actually made. I mean,
Absolutely. I think it's a beautiful, poignant example, Nancy, of kind of being in an in-between space, knowing that
mhm,
your life isn't going to continue, certainly not in the way that you've enjoyed it or lived it, but you're
right,
not as sure at all about what's coming next. And
right.
it's this time of incredible anxiety, but also, in fact, as we talked about on Sunday, and when we were talking in our death class, we were talking
Mhm,
about this moment as being incredibly creative. People having these beautiful visions of that
mhm,
enable reconciliation with loved ones and what have you. I think it's a great
mhm.
example. What about other folks?
I like to break it down to nature. I when you spoke of can't going back, you can't go back. You have to go forward. I thought of the metamorphosis of the tadpole becoming
Mm,
a frog. And
right.
I'm thinking, and somewhere in my life, I think of kids being teenagers. They can't become babies anymore. Now they've got to move forward to become an adult. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are great examples, Fran, where there are certain species where there is literally a transitional state of being, a
Yes.
cocoon, a tadpole, or what have you, where what was is no longer and what's to come isn't arrived just yet. We can definitely think of those teenage years as a cocoon or a tadpole moment where you're not quite a child, but you're not quite an adult. And so there's a lot of angst and anxiety, but also beautiful potential wrapped up in that time. Yeah, thanks, Fran.
I was going to share. I found it odd. I saw both my children this weekend. We went away on a short trip, and my daughter recently quit practicing medicine and opened her own business. And my son is about to finish his PhD. And there's just all this, as a parent, you're just looking at them and, they're doing good things and it's all good. And it looks very foggy out on the other edges. You're like, worried a little bit. Not that I don't have faith in them, but like those times in your life when you really are switching directions and you really aren't sure how it'll work out.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are wonderful examples. Finishing a degree, starting a business, what was isn't really existing anymore, what's to come isn't really clear. Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. What about other folks? Can you think of other examples of these liminal spaces?
I was going to say the same thing about opening my business. I mean, I was a respiratory therapist for 20.
Well, you've gone away.
I'm sorry, Dan, you froze a little bit. Sounded like you were saying you were a respiratory therapist for a long time and then you began this business. Okay. Yes, we'll wait for Diane to her reception to pick back up. And I don't know if Diane was going to move into this, but one really clear liminal space or example of liminal space that I see all over the place, certainly at our church, is retirement. That's
Mm.
another liminal space where the life you had is no more, but what comes next isn't exactly clear. And so it can be this incredibly anxiety ridden, anguished time, but also can be this incredibly creative, exciting time in folks' lives too. I see Cynthia pointing to
Mhm.
Paul. Yeah. Paul, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yes, I retired and we moved here right before COVID. And COVID gave me a pause to be able to think about and think through what I wanted to do in my retirement and what I wanted my retirement to be.
Mm,
And then through First Congo, we heard about a protest with Mariposas down against kids in cages downtown. And so I went to that. And that was right before COVID. And that got me thinking about activism. And the COVID gave me a chance to contemplate maybe I could get off the couch and become an active activist. And then towards after there was a vaccine and things were getting a little better and we were getting out, then Justin Pearson had a big rally against the pipeline. And that was it. I'm a full-time activist in multiple organizations. And
But it was murky for a long time.
it yeah. And I truly it's retirement's turned into a third act for me.
mm, mm. It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. But yeah, that murky space, when you're
Mhm.
leaving what was and then still not exactly sure about what's to come, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to invite us into looking at scripture now. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 4, focusing particularly on the story of Cain and Abel. Okay, here's Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Can y'all see this?
Yes.
Okay. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering the Lord had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. We're going to go through the rest of what happens in the story, but I'm wondering, just as we read this section here, what stands out to you, if anything?
Well, one, for me, I've never heard that verse before, or I don't remember it. And what stands out is that, uh, did I read this? Did I hear this right? That God was angry that he, with Cain for bringing him fruit?
That's interesting. That's sort of a question. What in verses 4 through 5 does that really mean? Where it
Yeah.
says that God had no regard for Cain's
Yeah.
offering.
Yeah. Seems
Yeah,
kind of cruel.
yeah, it's a curious point because that's what prompts Cain to be angry. Cain's angry because God does not show regard. In other translations, it says show favor for
Mhm.
Cain's offering. So that makes Cain angry. And it says his countenance fell, meaning that he was looking down.
Mhm.
So it really affected Cain, what happened there.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that piece is standing out to you, Nancy.
I can relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah. What about other folks? What stands out to you about this moment here?
What would stand out to me would be, why wouldn't the Lord not understand why Cain was angry?
Yeah.
That's what stands out to me. So it's, why are you angry? Well, Lord, I mean, you did for one and didn't do for the other.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. This is sort of a moment in which it seems that there are rules that God is enforcing, but didn't really describe what the rules were, at least not
Mhm.
as far as the author of Genesis records them.
I think the Lord is giving Cain something to make him stronger because
Hmm.
he's saying he has to master something. So maybe the Lord saw a little weakness in Cain,
Hmm.
and by by refusing to recognize his accomplishment, he wants him to do better.
Hmm.
That's how I see it.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Joy. Thank you. Well, there's this moment here where God asks Cain, "Why are you angry?" And then God says, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And then if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you. Sin desires you, but you must master it." That passage right there is really interesting because, in a way, what we're seeing is the difference between, perhaps, approval and acceptance. So
Mm.
even though Cain's offering was not approved of by God, at least not to the extent that God approved of Abel's, God, at least to me it seems, is saying here, you're still accepted. I still accept you. And it's a subtle difference there that I think, particularly when we're in between times, it can be really confusing to hold both of those together. That simply because something that we've done isn't met with wide approval, it doesn't mean that we are rejected in our entirety. And it seems like what Cain's really struggling with here is that feeling. And you notice as we move into from verse 7 into verse 8, Cain doesn't reply, actually. All Cain does is hatch a plan. So after God says, I will accept you as long as you are doing well, keep in mind though, sin is lurking at the door. Cain makes no reply. Instead, he goes to his brother Abel and says, "Let's go out into the field." And then, when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed Abel. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain replied, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." Then the Lord said to Cain, "No, no, no. Whoever kills you will suffer a sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. So we move from this moment where Cain and Abel are offering their sacrifices, they're making their offerings to God. God really likes Abel's, doesn't really like Cain's. God reiterates, though, hey, you're good, I accept you. But nevertheless, Cain hatches a plan to kill his brother. What sticks out to y'all about this portion of the text of the scripture?
Well, sin certainly did follow him.
It's really true. Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, it's really true. It's interesting too that given our conversation that the way God puts it is that sin is lurking at the door, right? We're just talking about doors and the
Mm-hmm.
threshold of doorways, and there's a suggestion here that sin is in this place, waiting, lurking, desiring you. And then here's what Cain does when he's in this liminal space.
And it seems to me that his anger is a little displaced. It seems to be he should be angry at God, not at Cain. It wasn't, Cain's fault.
Right, right. So Cain is channeling all of his anger at Abel, or anger out at God, rather, to your point, Sherry, at Abel, and takes it all out on him to the point of murdering him. Yeah.
I think Cain's jealousy prevented him from really hearing what God was telling him. And I think that happens in real life many times.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Joy. That Cain wasn't actually able to hear God's consolation in verse 7. He's so blinded by his own jealousy, it deafens him to God's attempt to offer some consolation. Yeah.
And the jealousy led to scapegoating.
There we go. Yeah, absolutely.
But Pastor, I think he heard him. There's that threshold. He could either step across and commit that sin that's lurking at the door, or he could stay on the other side, because he heard the Lord. But here we are at that threshold, that jealousy that you just spoke of. Do I step across that threshold and kill Abel, or do I stand on the other side where I am? But he was in that. He stepped across.
Yeah, and you naming that, Fran, points to the fact that we actually maybe have two different kinds of liminal space going on right here. There's the liminal space of Adam and Eve having been exiled from the garden, trying to figure out what life looks like out here in the wilderness. And then there's the liminal space that follows Cain's discomfort, anger, sadness of not getting God's approval. That in and of itself kind of creates this liminal space. Ooh, I thought I was doing the right thing. I'm getting feedback that I'm not. I don't really know what to do next. And so what I'm going to do is eliminate what I have decided is the source of my pain and just kill my brother. So then I won't have to worry about being compared to him ever again. So maybe in a way we've got a couple of layers of liminal space going on here.
But you still see these kind of behaviors in us as humans now, right? Folks who, can't look internal, always look for it to be someone else, like Paul said, on the scapegoat. The thing that has always hit me funny is where he cries out, "My punishment is greater than I can bear," after he's already murdered somebody. He's stressed about being.
Yeah, I think you got cut off a little bit at the end there, Cynthia, but yeah, he's already committed this, and now he's having to
Or
deal with the
accountability.
consequences. Yeah, exactly. And he's saying that the consequences are too severe. And then what's interesting here is that he makes an assumption. Cain goes from lamenting his punishment to making an assumption that God's going to let people just kill him. And God says, no, 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 no. That's not what's going to happen, because and I'm going to protect you. And so, how human is that, where we go from this place of seeing the consequences for our actions and then jump right into conclusions and assumptions about what's going to happen to us next?
Hmm.
Any other thoughts, comments, or questions about this piece of things?
Well, I keep going back to receiving a medical diagnosis, and all you hear is the word cancer, and you don't hear what the doctor's saying after that. And then you've got to figure out what you're going to do. And you're certainly facing death, right? Because it's cancer. But that's when you can stop and have you know have some time to process everything. It may not be that bad. There may be other options. And so you got to talk through all that and figure all that out. And that's, I don't know, that's what I keep seeing and hearing in this whole scripture right now.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Nancy. And you naming that kind of brings to light a common response that people can have to receiving a cancer diagnosis themselves or hearing a loved one. Very commonly, people go to scapegoat or blame.
Mm-hmm.
It's all those years of smoking, or it's my aunt's fault because of her bad genes, or it's one thing or another,
Mm-hmm.
crowding out, just as you said, the information,
Mm-hmm.
crowding out the other truths, the other facts, the other realities that are also part of what's happening here. And so, the way Susan Beaumont, the author of this book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, she talks about this phenomenon in a way, this very common response to being in liminal space. Here's how she describes it. So, to negotiate the dysfunction of a liminal time, the uncertainty, the disorientation, the fog, and tap into the creativity, in order to be able to see this as a productive, creative, generative, original time, we have to act as an authentic self, a self fully rooted in the divine and free from the false constructs of the ego. And her point with that is that when we're in the midst of anxiety, when we're in this liminal space, and when we're in the disorientation of it, it's very tempting to do what we've been talking about, to scapegoat somebody else, to protect ourselves from the fear that maybe we've done something wrong, or from the fear that we've failed in some kind of way. We get caught up in trying to protect ourselves and project an image of authority or certainty or what have you. And we may do that by taking control in ways that aren't ultimately helpful. A way to think about what happened with Cain and Abel was that Cain felt as though he had lost control. He thought that he was going to make an offering and God was going to celebrate it, and God didn't. And so he decided that he would take control of the situation by eliminating the threat, by eliminating his brother. And so, what we see happening here, and as we've kind of walked through the story, a whole variety of moves that Cain makes that we're all saying are, in one way or another, Totally relatable. Knowing most of you as I do, I'm fairly certain none of you has killed your brother, but you do know what it feels like to be in that space of uncertainty and how scary that can be, and how easy it can be to confuse approval and acceptance, how easy it can be to fall into making assumptions, how easy it
Yes.
can be to start feeling like failure isn't an option. Can anyone relate to that feeling, and maybe talk a little bit about a time when you've been in your own liminal space, your own kind of in between time, and what it was maybe that made you feel like you couldn't fail?
Tony, what comes to mind when you've been talking about this is, I went through a time, mostly during COVID, of considering not being Christian because I didn't feel like it was where I was. I wasn't in the same place as what I had always known as being Christian. But, Joseph Campbell said, you don't have to leave your religion. You just have to have new eyes. And what I'm seeing in this is just it's sort of giving Christianity a bad name instead of really seeing that it's just about me, seeing it with new eyes. And so it I don't know if I'm explaining it very well, but it just clicked in. And it feels like that's what this is all about. It's like a metaphor for that for me.
Yeah, that's lovely, Diane. Yeah, being in that place where you're just not sure. It sounds like for you, where you were at was this way of being Christian wasn't working any longer, but it's not exactly clear how I could move forward with this identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so you finding that metaphor of new eyes was a
Mm-hmm.
way to move into it. And so much of what we're talking about is perception. So
Mm-hmm.
much about, as we look at Cain and Abel in this story, so much of where the failure was on Cain's part was to perceive with a wider vision. That even if God doesn't approve of my fruit offering, that doesn't mean that God doesn't approve of me. It doesn't mean that God rejects me. Um, that even though I'm being banished in this way, doesn't mean that God's just going to let anyone kill me. That move to making assumptions. So much of this is about perception. Yeah.
Mm.
Anyone else relate to that sense of fearing failure when you're in a sort of when you've been in a kind of an in between time?
I'm going to relate kind of an interesting recent one. The diagnosis of my eye condition, I was transitioning to, the change that was creating in my well-being. And so there was this event coming up where I was going to go on this first family trip. And I made the decision to uh, medicate with steroids for a second time because my eyes had were not going to let me drive. That was the dilemma: was would I have the safety of being able to drive this group of people without that? So I was in that place where I didn't know how to, what all the parameters were of what my current condition was, and I made that decision and kind of forced through it. And it wasn't the best decision in the world, but some of what we were talking about really kind of echoed that place I was in where I was feeling fear about not being able to achieve this normal thing I could do and didn't look at the big picture, that it wasn't that threatening, or did not look at it fully enough or something like that. Just some of the similarities were there.
Absolutely. It's beautiful, Keith. Thank you for that. Yeah, that sense of striving, that we've got to continue being, even though circumstances have changed, it's very easy for us to get locked into a sense that, well, I need to still perform at the same exact level that I've always performed. Even though everything's different, I still need to charge through, I still need to push through. I don't need to adapt, I just need to move along as if everything were the same, even though
Well
it's not.
said, well said.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, thanks for that. And so, anyone else, by the way, I want to share on that question, thinking about failure and being in liminal space. Well, as folks have really looked at this phenomenon of what it means to be in this in-between time and all the disorientation and the anxiety and the doubt, what do we do with that? How do we get to a place where we can start seeing liminal space as a generative, original, creative time rather than just an anxiety ridden time of disorientation? In her book, Susan Beaumont talks about the importance of acting with presence. Acting with presence. I'm going to share a quote from her. And this is basically a move away from acting out of ego only, acting out of a sense um, of fear and worry. So for Susan Beaumont, she says, presence, acting with presence, it's an awareness characterized by an openness to wonder. Presence demonstrates a willingness to experiment, to take risks, and to learn from mistakes. It is guided by spirit, and it is willing to face failure. So rather than being in this place where all we see in the in-between spaces, in these liminal spaces, are all the pitfalls and possibilities for failure, rather than focusing on avoiding those, we take efforts to just be present with them and to give ourselves permission to take risks. So really what we're talking about here is a particular kind of consciousness, a particular kind of perception. And so it's a move from kind of a narrow focus on what's going wrong or what feels bad into a greater sense of the whole. I mean, a couple of us have already named looking at the bigger picture. That's what the move is. To try and see that even though I don't really know where I'm going, I don't really know what's happening, to be able to step into a wider vision so that we can see beyond just what we think, what we feel, what we want, what we're afraid of. If you notice, one of the very first things that God says to Cain, let me back up, after they have their exchange about where Abel is, one of the very first things that God says to Cain is, listen. Listen. In other words, do the thing that you weren't able to do before because your jealousy was so much in the way. Listen. And he's inviting Cain to listen specifically to his brother's crying out, his brother's blood crying out from the ground. God says to Cain, have a wider vision. Look beyond your own jealousy, your own pain, your own worry and fear, and be able to listen. I'm curious, and this relates a little bit to the first question that I asked y'all as we were kind of introducing each other and introducing ourselves to one another about stress and what you do in stress. Relatedly, I'm wondering, do y'all have ways of kind of helping yourselves see a wider picture? Do you have ways of kind of stepping out of yourself to get more perspective? How do you do that?
Well, I think the word meditate has a lot to do with it. Because as I'm swimming, I'm meditating. I'm not even thinking about my physical presence, but mentally I'm thinking, and then after the stress leaves you, I can see it a little bit clearer.
Hmm.
Does
So
that make sense?
absolutely. So there's sort of a clarity, it sounds like, that you're able to sink into when you're swimming.
Right, right.
Just sort of clearing away some of the noise, some of the distraction, just being present. Yeah, thank you, Joy.
Pastor, ask that question one more time.
Just, I'm curious if you have ways that you can, when you know, all right, my view on this thing is way too narrow. I'm too caught up in my feelings about it, or I'm too caught up in my fears or anxieties. Do you have ways of kind of stepping out, stepping back, so that you can have a broader view?
It's called sleep on it.
There you go.
I have to sleep on it. And in all honesty, that is what goes with me, because whatever I wake up in the morning, if whatever's on my mind, this is the way I'm gonna flow.
Mm,
Okay, so if I said sleep on it, I've taken it to bed with me. You can believe when I wake up in the morning, I should have it resolved,
mm.
and or at least I attempt it. Yeah.
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 Oh, I
Hmm.
love that. Just sleep. Let sleep do some work to kind of clarify and resolve. Yeah.
So, and what Fran said to me, it's like quieting the mind.
Mhm.
And it's also what Joy was saying. It's just getting out of your thoughts and your ego and your whole history and just being in a quiet, more expansive place.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And y'all are naming exactly the kinds of methods that Susan Beaumont talks about. The way that she summarizes it, though, is that a way to move into presence is by moving from striving to surrender. This is how she describes it, moving from striving to surrender. Yeah, Cynthia, what are y'all thinking about?
Hey, it's Paul, and I'm going to answer this last question
Mm-hmm.
and the one before. So, 2 questions ago, something came into my spirit, but I just wasn't ready to talk about it. But now it's perfect for this question. So the liminal door, where you kind of have to decide to step through it or not. In my first career in the car business, I was managing a car dealership, and we got a new general manager, and he eliminated my position suddenly, just called me in one day and fired me. That was a liminal moment. I could go home defeated,
Mhm.
or something else. So now this current question: what do you do to deal with stress? I wasn't a Christian. I had no relationship with God at that time. What I do now is pray. I go for a drive and pray. I go for a walk and pray. But I didn't pray back then. But I did go for a walk. And then I did go for a drive 30 miles down the road to another dealership that was owned by the same man. And I knocked on his door, sat down, had a visit with him, told him the unfairness of what had just happened. So it was about right and wrong for me. This was wrong. And he agreed. But he said, Paul, you got to understand, I just put that guy in that position and he's highly recommended. So I'll tell you what, you can be my used car manager at this dealership. So I went down 3 notches in status and pay and took a lesser position. And it was kind of like that guy that had to wait for his wife for 7 years. I worked very hard for him up a couple more positions in that dealership. And within about 6 months, he fired that GM that had fired me and put me in his job. And I went back to take over the dealership that I had been fired from. For me, it was to get quiet, go for a walk, and then go for that drive. And now I'm doing those things, but I have a personal relationship with the God that had his hand on me anyway, the whole time. I just wouldn't recognize it back then. I thought it was all about me. Woo, thank you. Needed to say that.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for saying it. You know, and it's a perfect example of how you stepped through that threshold with no idea about where taking that lesser position was going to take you. But then 6 months later, you find yourself in the position of the person who let you go, who pushed you out. And so, in a way, your story too is an example of surrendering. This isn't what I chose, this isn't what I want, but this is where I am. And I'm going to surrender to it. What if Cain had surrendered to the reality that his offering did not find favor with God? What if he had just surrendered to that? And maybe asked God, well, God, what could I have done differently? What could I do differently in the future? Instead, he was deaf to God's response, even God's consolation. And so it's an invitation, really, to do something other than what might be our habit, rather than striving and resisting reality and trying to take control. What Susan Beaumont invites us into, and what all of you are naming in one way or another, is the move into surrender. It doesn't mean that we give up. It doesn't mean that we stop caring. It doesn't mean any of that. What it means is we slow down, we take a breath, we sleep on it, we meditate, we go for a walk, we go for a drive, we do the work to let the noise clear out and quiet down, so that we can see what we might be invited into next. It's a form of discernment rather than just diving into decision making. And so what we're going to be doing as we move through this series, and I say this by way of closing as we get towards 11 o'clock, what we're going to be doing in this series is thinking together consistently about what it means to move into that place of surrender, and what it means to, what are the hazards that we're going to encounter along the way. So today we talked about the hazards that are associated with not just ego, but how we can be deaf to the possibilities, deaf to the reality of where we are because of anger or jealousy or scapegoating, all these different strategies we might use to distract from the simple fact that we're scared or we're anxious or we're doubtful. And so as we move forward into our series, we're going to continue to look at not only the pitfalls of being in liminal space, but also the incredible possibilities that it presents to us as we become the people that God is inviting us to become. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Are there any other questions or comments before we close for this week?
It's been a great session.
Good. Thanks, Diane. I'm glad. And thank you all so much for sharing your stories and inviting us into your lives and the ways in which liminality, these in-between realities, have shown up for you. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you next week if you're able to make it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tony. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.